I actually have been enjoying this series and very curious about how it's been for you, and several of you have given me some feedback. And what I'm realizing is that this series is a bit instructional as well as being inspirational. And some of the feedback I've received has been that you like that. You like learning, something about more the didactic approach to spiritual education along with inspiration. And so we're sort of continuing. So these messages we're going to fill in some of the blanks perhaps for some of you that, what does unity teach? And specifically, what is our understanding of Jesus and his role in our philosophy? Where do we connect the Jesus of history to what we hold to be our tenets, our basic tenets of understanding? And it is important for us to do this because it's so often there's a confusion that people have when people come to a unity experience like this and they hear the message. It sounds very open and liberating. It sounds very accepting. It sounds very broad, and it sounds like we embrace universal spiritual ideas here. But then we mention Jesus, and then people sometimes go like, oh, so you're a Christian or not? And so I think it's important for us to sort of tease out the significance of Jesus in our teachings. And that's what we've been doing more specifically these last few weeks, and we'll continue for at least another week. And I want to read from the book that this series has been based on in part, not in all. It's The Wisdom Jesus by Cynthia Bourgeau. And Cynthia Bourgeau she was an Episcopal minister, but she is so much more than that. She has really been quite a scholar, particularly around the wisdom teachings across other religions as well. And so we're focusing really on Jesus as a wisdom teacher. So what does that mean? And this is a quote I want to share with you. He says, Jesus was a wisdom teacher, a person who clearly emerges out of and works within an ancient tradition called wisdom, sometimes known as Sophia Perennis, which is in fact at the headwaters of all the great religious traditions of the world today. It's concerned with the transformation of the whole human being. Transformation from what to what? Well, for a starter, from our animal instincts and egocentricity into love and compassion, from a judgmental and dualistic worldview into a non-dual acceptingness. This was the message that Jesus, apparently out of nowhere, came preaching and teaching. A message that was radical in its own time and remains equally radical today. And the reason, of course, that it's radical today is because Jesus was talking about something that seems to elude the normal way that you and I process reality, which is what? Through our physical senses. He called it what? Don't judge by appearances, but by righteous judgment. And basically what he was saying and all of his teachings was turn around, turn within, look within for your well-being, look within for this, whatever we call it, whether we call it God or whether we call it infinite intelligence or unconditional love or whatever the ultimate reality is. It's not going to be found through the mind. It's not going to be found. We're not going to figure it out. We're not going to grok it with some sort of logical interpolation of the appearances of life, no matter how sophisticated we become and how powerful our microscopes become and how much artificial intelligence we get and how fast our computers get. We're not going to figure it out that way. It's never going to become more clear. In fact, our attempts to make sense out of this reality through the external means will only confound us. It will only cause us to deepen our confusion and our suffering. And this is counterintuitive to the way you and I typically take our understanding of life and where we look to decide what is real, yes? Because, this thing about getting real has more to do with becoming more literal in our taking in life as it appears to be. And when we do that, we're actually building up a false reality on top of a false reality. We're giving more credence to what is outside of ourselves and giving barely a nod to this dimension of who and what we are, this kingdom of God, as he called it. And he said it is where? Sorry, he said it's within. So all of this struggling to learn and to become more spiritual, if it's done through the mind, if it's done through study, if it's done just merely through study, then we stay at this plane, this three-dimensional plane. And at this three-dimensional plane, we will seek, not find, and haven't we done this? Haven't we all done this? Haven't we wondered where does really peace come from? This whole thing about love and unconditional love, I mean, we hear that this is the ultimate truth, and yet I'm not experiencing that. And where is it? Is it just in those few spiritual masters in the world who have embodied this incredible heights of spiritual awakeness, enlightenment, that only they could know this love and be this love? Or is it possible that this actually is the deepest truth of our being? That it is as widespread as we are, but it is beneath the radar of our ordinary consciousness, a place we seldom look. And this is what all of the masters have said, haven't they? All of the mystics have said this. All of the mystical teachers of every tradition have said, look within. You can have a direct relationship with the divine. You don't need a mediator. You don't need anyone to explain it to you. You don't need anyone to even mediate the understanding, because it's what you are. It's what you are. So Jesus went about in his own way teaching this. And he did it through precepts and words and parables. And he confounded the people of his time, didn't he? The disciples were, scratching their heads just like we do. And he would sometimes even chide them a little bit, wouldn't he? And say, how many times do I have to tell you? That kind of thing, Or he would say things like, you have heard it said, but I say unto you. So he would correct the surface mind perception, or the sort of the old teaching, which was based on dualism, based upon a God up in the sky and us down here, which was all based on the notion that in order for us to have this connection with God, that we had to somehow mediate this apparent distance between us and a distant God. And Jesus said, no, you have heard that said, but I say unto you that the kingdom of God is within you. And you say 3 more months and then comes the harvest. And I say, the fields are already ripe. It's a here and now reality. And how many of us spend much of our time here and now? Even now, I bet you're thinking about what's next. Either what I'm going to say next, or where you're going to lunch, or whether you will go to the beach today or not to the beach today, or some version of this. It is a mental exercise that is seemingly working against this focus of being here now. And so we have to become more diligent and more vigilant, and that's really what spiritual life is all about. It's about slowing down. It's about becoming more present to this moment, to be so open to what is here now, that we stop looking for some version of reality that we would equate to fulfillment or wholeness or well-being. We let go of those stories because they're only cloaking devices that obscure the truth of our own being, in which our needs have already been met. It's tricky. It's tricky. That which seems to be so far from us couldn't be closer. Couldn't be closer. Jesus said, closer than hands and feet, closer than breath. What's closer than to me? One teacher I listened to at a time was trying to describe this, of how we could become one with who we really are, to our true nature. And he said, okay, everybody stand up. You don't have to do this. Just stand up, okay? Now, take one step closer to yourself. These are the kind of, it's like a koan, and Jesus did this kind of stuff too, So moving, the idea that we could be closer to ourselves is not something that we're going to do physically. It's not going to be a change of our understanding of this three-dimensional reality. It's going to be about moving our attention inward to see what's already here now, not something that would come apart from afar. So we've been playing with these metaphors. We've talked about the computer metaphor, that, this idea that our mind is dualistic or binary mindset, and that's really just the idea that we think in terms of subjects and objects. There is me, and that's the subject, and then there's everything outside of me, and that's the object, and that's dualistic, right? And what we're looking for is not to become more keenly aware of that separation, but to get more familiar with you as a subject, because it is in you that all of life is experienced. You are the screen, you are the field in which all of life is known. You and I have never known life apart from our experience of it, have we? Could you ever know life apart from your experience? And where does the experience take place? Within us. And so this is what mastery is about, is we tend to think it's about manipulating objects, and so they become more pleasing to the subject. But the real mastery is to become more familiar with the subject, which is our own awareness, our own consciousness, in which all is provided. So, what did Jesus teach? Well, he taught a lot of things, and we're going to focus a little bit today. Oh, we're out of time. Time flies when you're off your notes. I want to give you a little bit on a couple of the Beatitudes. You all heard of the Beatitudes? Yes, attitudes of being. Does anyone know what beatitude means? Of course you do. Some of you do. What does beatitude mean? Blessing. Blessing. It's a simple word, blessing, because they all start with blessed are those. So it means blessings. And so Jesus was pouring out all of these blessings. And, there are 8 of these Beatitudes, and many of us have heard them over and over again. And they're perplexing to a lot of people, particularly people who don't have this non-dual understanding, because it sounded like Jesus was saying things that are contradictory and paradoxical. And they just, make the mind get wrapped around the axle. And some people just give up trying to teach on these things. But if we know Jesus was pointing to this ultimate reality of our being, then we can see them in a different light. And we can see them in a light that actually is consistent with what we're seeking to know. So the first one is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. much could be made out of this in a literal sense, and I'm not going to bother with that. You could all have your own opinions about what that is. But from a wisdom perspective, which is the way we're looking at these, poor in spirit designates this attitude of receptivity, being open, being willing, having the uncluttered mind and heart. Poor in spirit because, if you're strong in spirit, it's sort of like, you know. And there's nothing worse than someone who knows to stand in the way of spiritual understanding. Because spiritual understanding is obscured by the mind that thinks it knows it. The mind knows nothing of the truth. But it has all kinds of opinions. And so much of what Jesus has been to the world has been somebody that people needed to believe in. We need to believe in Jesus, as if believing in him was more important than believing from his understanding, believing what he believed and what he knew. And that's what unity does. We don't look at the story about his life and what his life meant and what his death meant. We listen to what he taught, just like you would listen to any other teacher. What did he teach, and where was he coming from? And that's the richness, that's the gold from this master teacher. So poor in spirit, meaning open, receptive. You maybe have heard this story before. It's a well-told and retold story. It's a Zen story about a young student who is seeking out this certain master, and he goes to this master, and he sits down in front of the master, and he can't wait to tell the master what he knows and what he's learned and how enlightened he's become. And the master is pouring him a cup of tea as this young student is, bubbling over. And as he's pouring the tea, he keeps pouring and the cup fills up and it begins to overflow. And finally the student says, "What are you doing? It's already full and it's overflowing." And he says, "Yes, and so are you." So are you. So if we don't have an empty cup, if we don't have some sense of I'm willing to not know, we're looking for infinite wisdom and unconditional love. And what do we know of such things? Our mind will equate it into somebody or something and block the true path. What do we know of the infinite realm? And so the more that I can let go of what I know, the more room there is for the truth to take the place of what I let go of. The false, who I'm not. The little s self who feels separate from life and so dependent on life to be a certain way to be okay. That's the one that's got to go. Thomas Merton once said, "At the center of our being is a point of nothingness, which is untouched by sin and by illusion, a point of pure truth, a point or spark which belongs entirely to God." This would be the kingdom of God within. But it appears to the mind as emptiness, as nothingness. If you had a great artist who you commissioned and you gave him a painting that you had started and said, "Do your mastery," he would say, "Why don't we start with a blank canvas?" And this is what the Divine Master says to us. I do my best work with a canvas that has not been influenced by what you think. But we're so smart. At times, don't we think we got it? Even this whole thing about being awake and enlightened the ego can just take that on. and we become an enlightened ego. Nothing worse than enlightened ego, and there are teachers out there. These are the ones one must be careful. Yeah, yeah. So, what gets in the way of knowing this is who we think we are. And you have heard me say this time and again, that, what we are looking for is this consciousness or this awareness, and it is not the little me. It is not the little me. It's not my thoughts, because my thoughts what? Come and go. But you don't. Is it my feelings? My feelings come, and then I notice they go. And here I am. Well, of course, the body is always vying for that position of who you are. And, they say that after 7 years, all the cells in your body have regenerated, and you are literally not the person you were 7 years ago at the cellular level. So I guess you couldn't be the body, because which body would you be? Every day it's changing. Of course, other ones that are popular are our career, our beliefs, our name. But can't we just change all those things? And don't we? And yet somehow something remains that we say, that's who I am. I am one who's been there through this and through that, and those years, those early years, and then those years, and the teenage years, and that was difficult, and then that relationship, and that ended, and I was still there, and I watched her come, and I watched her go, and then I got a job, and I had that, and I was I was an accountant, I was a baker, a candlestick maker, I was something, I was somebody, and then that ended, and then yet I was there too when it ended, and I've always been there. I've always been there. Who is this I? Who is this I? That never seems to change, always seems to be on the scene. Who we are is this awakened awareness that we can cultivate. And the last one I want to share with you today is the one that many people, I think, struggle with. They struggle with a lot of them, but this one is, the blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. What was Jesus talking about? Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. What he was talking about, according to Cynthia Burgo, and I see the same clarity of understanding here, is that he was talking about vulnerability and flow. That you and I, when we are the most vulnerable, which is something that sometimes we just guard against, don't we? This feeling of being vulnerable. When we are the most vulnerable, we are the most malleable. We're the most ability to be able to move into a new awareness of what we are when we're not stuck in a formed version of who we think we are. And sometimes when we go through loss, whether it's a job or money or a situation that is taken from us, or we lose a loved one in our life, which happens to every one of us and has happened, maybe fresh for some of you. It feels like nothing else. We feel vulnerable. And yet what the Master is saying here is that in that vulnerability, your cup has emptied. And now you are most ripe for a new understanding. And this isn't like New Age, Pollyannish, happy thinking, where we just take a bad situation and make it into a good situation so we feel better. This is actually points to a profound spiritual truth. When we mourn, we are in a state of free fall. To mourn is by definition, according to Cynthia, to live between realms. to live between realms. Because when you mourn, you are really giving up what you thought would always be there. And now you have to trust and surrender and give up and let go. And all of those are wonderful attributes for spiritual awakening. Yeah? Do we know that? Have we had those experiences where we were simultaneously torn by circumstances, our heart carved out by the pain of loss? And yet if we followed that thread of that process and didn't stop it before it was complete, we could actually find at the bottom of that seeming bottomless feeling something substantial, something more real. We land in a place of what we would say would be divine compassion or love. I want to share with you, I've read this sometimes at memorial services. It's a very long poem. I'm going to read parts of it to you from John O'Donohue. And see if you can, when you hear this mention of loss of a loved one, you know that this loved one is the one, is the L, capital L loved one, your divine self, God, whatever. He says this: in grief, all you can depend on now is that sorrow will remain faithful to itself. More than you, it knows its way and will find the right time to pull and pull the rope of grief until that coiled hill of tears has reduced to its last drop. Gradually, you will learn acquaintance with the invisible form of your departed. And when the work of grief is done, the wound of loss will heal, and you will have learned to wean your eyes from that gap in the air and be able to enter the hearth in your soul where your loved one has awaited your return all the time. Most of us don't give ourselves, myself included, give ourselves permission to take this journey of loss as far as it needs to go. Because we're too addicted to feeling happy and feeling good. Who can fall? But you'll know if this is right for you, that if there's something that you haven't mourned completely, and oftentimes the mourning has to do with life just didn't turn out the way it was supposed to. You know? That's a good place to start. We all have this voice all the time that says, oh, this is not right, and that's not right. And what if we just allowed ourselves to mourn this apparent loss? See where it takes us. Because the masters have said that at the bottom of your suffering is the truth of who you are. And that's the end of suffering. When you stop looking for life to be different, when I stop seeking life to be a particular way, which keeps the hamster wheel of dissatisfaction going, right? Whether that's with my relationships or my job or the government or the world, that seeking keeps the mind alive. And when the mind is alive and well, it is the greatest obscurer of what we are. Yes? So somehow we find a way to allow this seeking to come to an end by having a memorial service, yeah? For the unmet expectations of life. Not that we give up going after what we want. That isn't the problem. The problem is we're unfamiliar with what we already are. And so we seek, but we don't find. So I realize I'm ending sort of on a somber note here, but this really feels like important teaching. And so I'm just trusting that this is where I want to end. I would love for us to, and I'm not going to do it today because we don't have the time. I would love for you to consider this. And of course, you can always get this message on YouTube or on our new live streaming site and listen to it again. And see if there isn't some value for you in taking this process of emptying out. What are you still holding? What am I still holding? And this is what I've been doing this week. Even though I've been at the beach, I've been asking, what am I holding on to that is an illusion, that is not connected with the truth of my being? What is the false God, that is not showing up for me? We had some friends with us this week too, and we were talking about how, as we were going through life, we were all excited about this stage of our life. And we saw those stages of our life from the perspective of a separated self. In other words, this is going to be my fulfillment. This person is going to be it. This job, this degree, this level of income, this house, this whatever. And all of those things are fine if they're held in the context of what comes and goes. Because they do, don't they? But what is it that doesn't come and go? That's the exploration. And sometimes we have to let go of that cherished idol. And when we let go of it, then what we are emerges. Jesus embodied this when he said, I'm going away, but the Spirit will come after. And I think Jesus knew that many people were making him into their God. They were revering him and worshiping him. And what they were doing is taking this beautiful message that was saying, who you are is what I am pointing to, and they made it about him instead of what he was pointing to. And so many of the awakenings took place after Jesus left the planet. Those disciples who denied him, betrayed him, later were willing to give up their life for this teaching. It was after he was gone. They looked where he was pointing, and they discovered the truth of his teachings. And that's what we're invited to do. And we shall. Amen? Amen. Amen.